Hey there, today we're going to be talking about the topic of uncertainty, luck, and randomness. A lot of games feature one or more of these, and indeterminacy is a huge part of game design. I mean, there are very, very few games that have zero luck and randomness out there. There are levels of uncertainty in just about every situation that we face. But, the difficult part is there's so many different concepts and terms that are used to define uncertainty and luck that it's really hard to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So again, to make sure that we're talking apples to apples, oranges to oranges, etc., we're going to define the terms for what they mean related to game design in this context. Now, again, depending on what you're talking about, different people or different topics may have different meanings for these three terms. But for the purposes of this discussion and my views on game design, we're looking at it in this way. And the first topic is uncertainty. And what you need to think about uncertainty is just the vast unknown. But what's important to know is that this vast unknown can be chipped away at. It can be mitigated, it can be offset, often with experience or greater understanding. So anytime we're faced with a new situation, we are faced with uncertainty. And it's only that over time or through some method, we could learn more about it by doing research. We could learn more about it by experiencing it firsthand. We could learn more about it by talking to somebody who's faced that. So if we take a look at topic Texas Hold'em poker, there's uncertainty when we sit down at the table over a lot of different things. For example, after they deal out the first couple cards, there's some uncertainty knowing what's left in the deck because other people have cards that they've been dealt as well. And every time a new card is revealed, such as seeing some cards out on the flop, or as we see different players bet and whether they're going to be playing aggressively or conservative, we start to chip away at that uncertainty. The players that we face at the table, they are other sources of uncertainty. We don't know if they've got a very aggressive play style or a conservative play style. We don't know if they bluff, and we're not sure about that. But the more we play with those players, the more we have experience in those situations, the better we get at chipping away at that level of uncertainty. So there are a number of sources of uncertainty, right? So part of it is just a lack of familiarity with it. And that could be a lack of familiarity with the game or its elements. For example, the first time you sit down to play chess, even though it's perfect information, both sides have the same pieces and the pieces all do the same thing, there's still a lack of familiarity with it as you learn the rules. Plus your opponent. If you've never played against that person before, you don't know what their skill level is, you don't know what their tendencies are, and only over time are you going to be able to get better at that. Sometimes we also don't observe or recognize patterns right away. And so this can be the case in some tile placement games. Carcassonne is a really, really good example that there's a level of uncertainty with how the cityscape is slowly being built as we're placing tiles, and getting better at recognizing patterns like where a farm is or where a city is being built can help us chip away at that uncertainty so we can feel more confident about the choices that we make. If you're not very good at odds and probabilities, that's another big source of uncertainty. How likely am I to hit when I roll this in Dungeons & Dragons? Or how likely am I to roll a 10 or higher when I'm rolling this particular combination of dice? That's something that we could chip away at through research and start to know absolutely with complete information, or our gut instincts will slowly over time be able to tell us. Big source of uncertainty too, there are some games that I call games that require omniscience. There's a game, War of the Ring, which recreates wars in Middle Earth, and the first time you sit down, there's this huge deck of events, and you have no idea what sort of events could be in there. But these events can have a huge impact, so if somebody who is a rookie who's never sat down and played this game before is facing a veteran, and the veteran knows that if Gandalf enters the woods during this point, he turns from Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White and eliminates a whole bunch of dark forces. Well, how is the new player supposed to know that and form a strategy based around that? They can't. But over the course of time, as they play the game more often, if they take a look at that deck and they start to read through those events, whatever it might be, they can slowly start to chip away at that need for omniscience to be able to be competitive the first time that you sit down. Enough about that. Let's look at randomness. The important thing here, we can think of randomness, or RNG, random number generator. Randomness is a system, okay? Randomness is the means by which an outcome is generated. What's important here is that randomness is not chaos. Randomness follows rules. It's just that these rules don't follow player agency, direction, or influence. So while there is a consistent set of rules, the players aren't in charge of that. The system created those rules, and then the system is used to generate an outcome. Right? So in Texas Hold'em, the system is the 52 card poker deck. And randomness comes in by that system is shuffled and cards are dealt out of there. So seating assignments are set and all of these things. Randomness is the system by which we get to that state where we don't know what cards we're going to be dealt, but we do know that this deck of cards is going to be shuffled. We're each going to be dealt two, and that is the system used consistently with each of the players here. And how we were seated around the table was probably a random draw or some other system that they determined who's going to be sitting where around the table. So understanding those guidelines gives us a better understanding on what might occur. So if we can break down and understand the rules by which outcomes are generated, we have a greater understanding of the range of outcomes that are possible, the likelihood that certain outcomes may occur, and then once we see what our outcome is, we might be able to gauge the probability or the likelihood of somebody else's outcome. If I'm dealt pocket aces, for example, it is highly unlikely, based on how a deck of cards is shuffled and dealt out, that somebody else is sitting there with pocket aces. So there are a bunch of sources of randomness. Dice and cards are really, really common in board games, and we see those a lot. But something like Dungeons & Dragons uses randomness in a fantastic way, especially if you're the Dungeon Master and you're going through the Dungeon Master's Guide and you look at treasure, right? You're going to be looking at, okay, this creature dropped a certain amount of treasure, so I'm going to be rolling percentile dice and looking at this table, which tells me that they've earned some gold and some silver. Now I have to roll some six-sided dice to figure out how much gold and silver they get. So the chart and the table itself is the system. And then the dice that you're using create a range within that, and you follow the rules and you follow the guidelines, and then you get to the final result. Any sort of roguelike content generation, so things that are procedurally generated, use some system to be able to create that. So the levels, for example, in Diablo 3 are dynamically generated. There's some set pieces, like maybe a church or a cathedral, but then a lot of what you run into, the outline and contours of the map, the boss characters that you run into, all of those things are generated by a system, but there are still outcomes that are, have to fall within certain ranges in order for them to occur. Loot boxes are another great example. There's a system that tells you whether or not you're going to get a rare or whether you're going to get commons or what's actually going to be included in the loot box, but it is from among a certain limited range of things. You're not going to open up a loot box in Overwatch and get a watermelon, right? There's a set of rules there that governs what's going to come up. And then finally, a coin flip. We'll talk more about that one later. So if randomness is the system that generates outcomes, then what luck is a snapshot or a single instance from an outcome. Out of the huge range that the rules of randomness provide, out of that entire range, we're looking at one single outcome, one instance, one result. So back to Texas Hold'em, your initial hand of cards, the deck of cards and the shuffling generated all these possible outcomes, but the pocket aces that I was dealt, that was luck. That was one single snapshot. And then which cards are getting revealed along the way, those are also luck. So if rolling dice is the random generator, then the single die roll, I rolled a 5 on a 6-sided die, that would be luck. The specific map that was built, the specific loot that was dropped, and then which side a coin lands on, those are all luck. They are a single representative of the possible range of outcomes that the randomness generation engine or machine, that protocol of rules, allows for. So if we take a look at Dungeons & Dragons, great example of uncertainty, randomness, and luck. If you've never played D&D before, there's a high level of uncertainty, but the more that you sit down and play the game, the more familiar you get with the rules, the boundaries, what's accepted, the players at the table and their tendencies and their style, what kind of dungeon master you have and what their preferences are and the type of gameplay that they reward. Tons of randomness. There are lookup charts and tables. There are guidelines for how different characters are built or how spells are run or how monsters are managed. And then luck with all of the individual die rolls. So while combat might be resolved by rolling a 20-sided die and adding a modifier, that would be the randomness engine. That would be the rule structure, the protocol that gets followed and generates a range of outcomes. Then individual luck would be the die roll where I rolled a 17 on my d20 when I attacked the goblin, right? So D&D is a great example that features all of them. But even a game like Monopoly has a little bit of all. For example, even if you've played Monopoly before, there can still be uncertainty in the game based on who you're playing and not knowing their tendencies, how likely they are to trade or negotiate deals. But then also, chance and community chest, even though they are decks and they are known, when they're shuffled at the beginning of the game, there's uncertainty in the order that they're going to be in and what's in there. And if we haven't played in a long time, or the first time we play, we don't even know the range of possible outcomes there. Right? So not only do the decks provide uncertainty and randomness because shuffling a deck of cards is a system, luck would be the specific card that I draw. And then we get randomness with rolling the dice as the means by which we move around the board, but rolling a 7 or rolling a 3 or whatever it might be, rolling pairs 3 times in a row where you get sent to jail, all of those would be instances of luck because the player does not exert any agency or willpower over that. They basically roll the dice and then luck indicates or dictates how they move around the board. But even something that is pre-scripted does have uncertainty. So if we look at one of the classic examples, Mario level 1-1, like this is used in a lot of case studies or discussions about just game design in general. You start in the lower left, and there's all of this uncertainty when you sit down and play for the first time. Now, there's not randomness because all of the creatures that you encounter are scripted. They follow a pattern, but the pattern is consistent. And is there luck? Well, you're not getting just one outcome out of a pattern, but those characters move back and forth along prescribed routes, and things are very, very consistent. And the player is deciding when Mario jumps and when Mario moves left or right. So there's not luck in that case, but there's a lot of uncertainty. You don't know what all the buttons are going to do or how things are going to happen. But this level was designed in such a great way to help the player immediately start to chip away at uncertainty. You start in the lower left corner and you see this big expanse to the right. So the player knows that, well, I can't go further to the left. My character is facing to the right. I'm in the far left corner, so I'm facing right. And the right side of the board is open. That's where I can interact, so I will start moving to the right. And the more you move to the right, you're going to chip away at uncertainty. If you get hit by the Goomba and you die and you lose a life, you're going to learn, and that part of uncertainty of, I wonder what happens when it runs into me, that's over with. You've understood that. But also, as you play more and you get more familiar with the level layout, right? So you start out not knowing anything about the map, and it's all covered up, right? You don't understand what the possibilities for this level are. They weren't generated by random. This level was designed in a specific way for a reason. But after you have played it, you are able to uncover the fog of war of uncertainty. You chip away at that uncertainty with experience and practice. Diablo 3, on the other hand, has all 3 of these in spades. So there's a lot of uncertainty the first time you fire up the game and you've never played before, and what are these different character classes are going to be like, and is this going to fit my playstyle, and how difficult is it going to be when I crank up difficulty level to Torment 7 or something like that. Lots of randomness between which creatures are generated in a map, the type of map that is created, what is the system for generating loot that drops. It's really, really exciting when anything that's a green set piece, or you hear this ding and this golden shaft of light comes down from heavens and you know that a unique has spawned, and what is that going to be? So there are all of these complex systems and algorithms running in the background that helps generate these maps, that helps generate these results. But luck is the specific map, the specific rare item, the specific drop, the specific enemy boss and the characteristics that it has that are spawned on that instance when you're playing that represents luck. So really the system for generating, for example, an item in Diablo, you could think of it like this big slot machine where each one of the reels in the slot machine covers a different characteristic that could be created, so that there's a prefix that indicates some characteristic or trait that an item has, in this case freezing. And then there's a main category of item, in this case a weapon. So in this case we've got a mace, and then finally a suffix that's going to give some other characteristics to it. So we might end up with a freezing mace of rage, which would be different than the next time we pulled on this slot machine, and we ended up getting a critical axe of the stars, or whatever it might be. So all of these things, the slot machine follows rules, but when you pull the trigger and you need a specific outcome, what you get is going to be determined by luck. All right, so let's take a look more at this idea of unraveling uncertainty. So you encounter an alien who has never seen a quarter before. So you flip a quarter in front of them. You show them the quarter and then it's got two sides, heads and tails. But you flip the quarter in front of them for the first time and it comes up heads. So what conclusion should the alien reach by that? Well, 100% of the times that the alien has observed you flipping the coin, it has come up heads. So is it logical to conclude that every time you flip a coin, it comes up heads? Well, if that's all the information that they have, and that's all the observation they've made, then that might be a conclusion that the alien would reach. I drew that alien, by the way, so little brag there. So let's expand that scenario then, and now instead of just that one coin flip, we flip the coin 10 times. 7 times heads, 3 times tails. So now they've got a larger data set, and this data set shows 70% of the time a coin flip comes up heads. But we know that's not right because we've seen more coin flips. We understand better how that works. But when you're coming at it with a fresh set of eyes, when you're coming at it and you don't understand how this sort of uncertainty or randomness works, it can be really, really skewed because you've only seen a few examples of it. You don't have as much data to draw from. So then think about how many coin flips would that alien need before they knew with absolute certainty, no doubt, that flipping a coin is a 50-50 chance coming up heads or coming up tails. How many coin flips makes you absolutely sure? So in this case, we're flipping the coin 100 times. So after 99 flips, we've got a fairly large data set. So does that give us the information that we need to know what's going to happen with the 100th flip? No, it doesn't. It's still going to be 50-50 because we know that, but we've also observed so many times because of what's called a sample size. So the sample size is basically the percentage of a large population from which you're going to draw your conclusions or statistics. You use data gained from the sample to make inferences or to extrapolate information about the population as a whole. So in the coin flip example, our population is basically the total number of times that we could observe heads or tails. So what percentage of that population of this completely unknown amount of people who might be involved in this? This is a little bit different if we're talking about playtesting because we're talking about a population that is set, for example, the population of gamers who are interested in your game. But it's still, in this case, with the coin flip, we've got to think about what sample size, how many different instances do we need to be able to start to make inferences. So how many attempts do you need? How large a sample out of the population do you need to draw accurate conclusions? In playtesting, we often call this actionable information. If you've only seen a couple playtests, it can be really hard to know whether or not that feedback is accurate, whether or not that feedback should drive your game decisions. But if you've seen the same issue come up time and time again, eventually there reaches a point where the sample size is large enough from the population of gamers out there, from the total number of people who are interested in engaging with your game, that you can start to draw a conclusion that, you know what, this issue is something that I need to pay attention to, and that's actionable information. I feel confident that I've gotten enough feedback, that I've seen enough examples of this, that I can make a decision and move forward with it. Now, depending on the situation, there are a lot of different ways that you could mathematically arrive at a sample size, right? So there are lots of different ways that you could reach this based on the situation and based on the sort of sampling and based on the sort of information that you are trying to glean. There are a ton of different formulae out there, but they each have their own strengths and weaknesses. One of them is Sloven's formula, 1 minus 0.98 equals 0.02, where E 0.02 is the margin of error. So if you want a margin of error of 0.02, then it tells you how large your sample size needs to be in order for that margin of error, right? And this was theoretically developed in 1960, but there are disagreements about who actually created it, which is kind of an interesting backstory. But this is just one of many, many different ways that you can try to mathematically predict or establish how many examples, how large a sampling size do you need. When we see political polls, for example, at the bottom of every political poll, such as a presidential approval rating, at the very, very bottom, you will see the total number of people who were polled and then their margin of error. And it's interesting to see that often they will make these results, announced these results, 47% of this and 52% of that, based on what seems like an incredibly small sample size, maybe 1,800 people, 2,400 people. And you're thinking, how can only 1,800 people or 2,400 people actually be representative of this enormous population that we have, especially here in the United States, that this is meaningful information, that this actually feels accurate based on what we know about the population at large. So, unfortunately, there is no one ideal solution to this. Ideally, though, researchers or specifically playtesters will use a large enough sample size that they will accurately reflect the population they are observing. But, we don't always get to do what is ideal. Sometimes we are restricted by time or budget or whatever else it might be. It's unfortunate, but sometimes we are just subject to these restrictions. I would love to infinitely playtest a game, but that's not feasible because eventually that game needs to become a product that's on store shelves. So at some point you have to cut off playtesting, draw your conclusions, and move on. However, ideally, if we wanted to work with the best possible information, then we would simply test it as often as possible. Because the closer to infinite the sample size, the more accurate your results will be, and the better you can draw inferences or make conclusions based on that information. The more data you have, the better results, the better your decisions. But this is just talking about data. This is data devoid of context. This is data that doesn't care how it was generated or why it was generated or what it's going to be used for. Data might tell us that we are 90% more likely to do A or B or observe A versus B. Such as in this scenario, a goalie has to react to a penalty shot. The shooter they're facing goes left 90% of the time, and they only shoot to the right 10% of the time. So which side of the net should the goalie protect? Now, if we're just drawing data and conclusions from the sample size of this shooter's penalty kicks, and we look at the 1,000 shots that this kicker has made, and out of the 1,000 shots, 900 have been to the left and only 100 have been to the right. Now, on the one hand, maybe our knee-jerk reaction would be, well, obviously we should protect the left. That side is most likely to be targeted. But that's not necessarily the case. Because here in this scenario, the data that we have is not void of context. It has a very, very specific context. It is influenced heavily by something. In fact, game theorist Ken Binmore would argue that instead of a 90-20 proposition, that this is actually closer to a 50-50 chance. And that's because we're not dealing with raw data, we're dealing with people. So as soon as we take information and apply people and conscious thought and emotion and reaction, then we're bringing in a whole bunch of other baggage. And a lot of those things are going to influence our decision making. So when we're looking at the uncertainty, right, there are a lot of things that can happen. We know that there are going to be some anomalies and extremes. We can hopefully recognize some patterns. We can make some evaluations and calculations. But when we're looking at that example of the soccer game, the goalie and the shooter, we encounter this concept called Yomi. And Yomi is the Japanese word for the underworld. And in game design, though, Yomi has a very, very specific meaning. Yomi means reading or to read. And here we're talking about reading your opponent. Every game is not just the pieces at the table and the cards and the dice and the physical aspect of that board game, but every game is also a mind game. It is a game that you are playing psychologically with your opponent, not just physically with the pieces. So this sample of the goalie facing a shooter, it actually reminds me of The Princess Bride, in that scene where therefore I cannot drink the glass in front of me, because of that whole mind game of I know that you know that I know that you know that I know that you know that I know that you know. As the shooter, I know that you, the goalie, know that I go left 90% of the time. Therefore, I should shoot to the right. But I also understand that as the goalie, you realize that that's what I would be thinking, so I really should shoot to the left. And this could go on infinitely, but when we're dealing about people who have these emotional responses to otherwise rational data, we are going to be influenced by that. So while we can collect data and we can draw certain inferences, we can't rely solely on data. When it comes to game design, sometimes you've got to follow your gut. Sometimes you've got to make decisions that don't seem supported by the data, but that you feel will still make for a better game. So I want you to respect math, but don't be scared of it. So as long as you're able to follow a couple basics like tracking data, understanding the rudiments of probability, and then a topic that I really think is important, which is called diminishing returns, then I think you'll be in good shape. And data tracking is something that everybody can do, and they can do from the start. And I track a whole bunch of data when I'm designing games. I track data using just spreadsheets. So I'll track the possible outcomes when rolling icons on special dice. Or I will track all of the data for sets of cards across a whole bunch of different things. I was designing a game, 3 Years of War, where it's broken up into 4 seasons, and during the spring you're more likely to encounter certain results, positive outcomes, than in the winter where it's really harsh and different outcomes are going to be there. So I had to break down, all right, let's look at the number of positive outcomes in spring versus winter, and let's look at the number of negative outcomes in spring versus winter. And by tracking that data and having these spreadsheets filled with that, I can look at that and then be able to see that I think that these probabilities, that I think that this ratio that I have in the spring makes sense, especially when I compare it to winter, because I want spring to feel more resurgent and possible, and I want winter to feel more grinding and oppressive. But then there's also just the idea of basic probability. Again, this is a standard bell curve that we would get if we're rolling some dice. Most of the results that we have are going to land in that first standard deviation left or right, which is about 68% of the total possible outcomes. But again, people need to focus on these extremes. Because they only represent 0.1% to the far left or the far right, or 0.2% of the total possible outcomes, some people will design for that first or second deviation thinking this is what's going to happen most of the time. And they don't really pay much heed to those outer limits. And that's a problem. Because if I've learned anything in game design, it's that if it can happen, it will happen. And people rarely post about or share stories about the game that was completely average, the game where everything went exactly as expected. They talk about those anomalies. They talk about the things to the extreme left and the extreme right. When the most unlikely thing happened, like that one army in Risk that was able to protect Australia and hold off wave after wave of attacker, because I kept rolling 6s and you kept on rolling 1s. It's extremely unlikely, but our sample size is everybody who's ever played Risk ever. So the sample size is enormous. So out of all of those samples, some of them are going to be on the far left or far right. So just keep that in mind, that even the most rare and the most uncommon outcomes that can occur in your game, once it's released out into the wild, into the player base, and it is being played theoretically infinite number of times, you don't know exactly how large that sample size is, but it's going to be much larger than you've done with playtesting, that you're going to get some of these anomalies and extremes. All right, let's talk about diminishing returns. Now, There's a chart so that you know it's official, but diminishing returns is this economic concept that essentially the more you have of a thing, the less value each additional thing has than the one before it. This is true of just about everything, including money. Yes, there does reach a point where money ceases to have value to you. If I have no money and I find a $20 bill on the sidewalk, that is huge to me because I don't have any money to compare it to. If I'm Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos and I'm among the wealthiest people in the world, billions of dollars, finding $20 on the sidewalk is next to worthless to me because each additional dollar that I have past my first billion, $1,001, is that really that big of a difference? Going from $1,001 to $1,002, does that really make an impact? No. You reach a point where each previous thing has less value. Like I said, true of just about anything, like cookies. I like Oreos, and that one Oreo, that first Oreo, pretty satisfying. Having a couple more Oreos, that's still satisfying and enjoyable. But, the fourth Oreo isn't quite as satisfying as the first. The sixth Oreo, maybe I'm starting to not enjoy these or I'm reaching a comfortable limit. Eventually you will reach a point where they might have negative value. That 5,000th Oreo has negative value because it made you sick. This is important in game design because if players can keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, and there's no diminishing return, there's no reduction in value, then they're not really making a choice. They're spamming a calculated outcome where they know that this is always going to return the same value. So an example where we built in diminishing returns because we wanted people to play differently, in the Star Wars role-playing game, Edge of the Empire, we created healing kits, and you can use a healing kit, and the first time that you use it during a period, it's going to recover 5 wounds. The second time you are healed with a healing kit, it only recovers 4 wounds, and the next time it only treats you for 3 wounds, and so on, until eventually the healing kit will no longer work. So the first time you know that you're going to be healed for a certain amount, and that's great, you can get back into the battle. But eventually there reaches a point where, you know what, I gotta change my decision making. I can't run down a hallway and face a bunch of stormtroopers because I'm going to get hurt and I'm not going to be able to recover as quickly as I would otherwise. So we built in diminishing returns so that over the course of gameplay, players would need to break a pattern, players would need to start thinking differently and reacting differently in the game. We can see this in video games. If you're in a fighting game and you can just spam the X button repeatedly and it always helps you. I remember once in Tekken, there was a character, Gon, who was this little dinosaur, and he had this tail slap. Now, he was shorter than most characters' punch zone or high kick, and tail slap was long enough that he could also avoid most of their low attacks. So you could just spam X over and over and over again and basically just grind your way through the game. It took no skill, and it never depreciated in value. There was never a reason to not do that, because it was a winning strategy and it never diminished in value. So when we're talking about all of these, a lot of times luck gets a bad rap. People think that luck in a game is a bad thing. Well, pure luck in a game, where it's really just drawing a card from the deck and whoever drew highest wins, yeah, that might not be fun. But a blend of these things can have a huge influence on the game, especially if you provide ways to mitigate or offset luck by including player agency and some decision making. So maybe I draw 3 cards on my turn, but I can only play 1. So randomness was the deck of cards, luck are which 3 that I drew, and then my player agency is which one of those 3 do I play for the round. So these can have a huge variety of impacts on a game based on how heavily they influence the outcome. Players tend to be more tolerant of luck the more opportunities that they have to mitigate or offset it, or the more often luck occurs so that you can balance out and smooth the curve, and they're not just going to be screwed by a certain one outcome from the game. They also impact the heuristics. Heuristics, again, positional heuristics, or evaluating how well you are doing at any given time, is certainly impacted. Knowing that a system has luck in it you're going to evaluate your position differently because you know relative to the other players, they may be able to gain or fall back, or the positions relative to you may shift over the course of the game. And there are some risks involved too. If you're overly reliant on luck, people will deem that your game has less strategy, or maybe they will think that it is meant for a younger audience who does not have the sophisticated reasoning yet, or deductive skills or strategic skills to make smart, informed, tactical decisions. And if that's the case, then luck might be used to help drive the game and make sure that the game actually advances and moves forward, rather than stalling out waiting for somebody to make a decision. So I'm not saying that any of these are good or bad or better than the other. I'm not a fan of games personally that have perfect information like chess, and they're completely structured where the only uncertainty is your opponent, because I'm not good at those particular types of games. But chess and Go and Nikala have been around for centuries or millennia for reasons, because people do enjoy the challenge of knowing that both players have the same information. Now, who uses that information better, right? So different types and different levels of uncertainty, randomness, and luck are going to appeal to different players. So just make sure that you understand the different aspects of luck in your particular game. What are the sources of luck? Do I have dice? Do I have spinners? Do I have a chart? What is it that is generating these different possible outcomes? How much influence do players have over it when they get a particular outcome? When luck gives them a particular outcome, they roll a 6 on this die, or they get this particular item of loot, then what power do they have? What player agency do they have to either work around that, work with that? How are they modifying the rest of the gameplay around the outcomes that this random system is giving it? So if you give the player enough choices, then they can still make meaningful, impactful decisions, even with a game that introduces high levels of luck. And if this idea of uncertainty in gaming appeals to you, then I would strongly encourage you to check out this book, Uncertainty in Games by Greg Costikyan. It's a fantastic book, and it's relatively short as well. He goes into more detail about uncertainty in video games like the Mario 1-1 level, and about how uncertainty appears in there. But it's a fantastic resource. I encourage you to check it out. You can get it online through Amazon, any bookseller, or if you're a student, you probably can get it through your university library. But otherwise, just be mindful of how luck, randomness, and uncertainty are present in your games so that you can design for it and make sure that your players are going to enjoy and engage with it meaningfully. That's it. Thanks.